Hello, everyone, and welcome today for this session of the Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute's Research Webinar Series. My name is Richard Harris, and I'm happy to be the moderator for this day's webinar session. I'm a new faculty at the University of California, Irvine in the Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute and the second endowed chair in the institute, as well as I'm a professor in the Department of Anesthesiology and Perioperative Care. So it's my pleasure to be able to moderate today's session. Before we get started, I want to remind you of some housekeeping items. So this session is being recorded. So if you missed this session, you can watch it later on the recording. We will send all registrants the link to the recording, and we will post the link on our event webpage as well, so you can see it there. We ask everyone to please remain muted during the talk to limit distractions, but you can communicate with us by submitting questions in the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And we will take questions at the end of the presentation as the time allows. So to remind everybody, the Samueli Institute is committed to whole person health research, education, and clinical care. Our interdisciplinary researchers are dedicated to exploring the science of disease prevention and treatment. We bring this series to you to share the promising integrative health research that is occurring throughout the Institute's pilot studies and grants from the Samueli Scholar Awards. To date, the Institute has supported 25 investigations with the potential to enhance our understanding of integrative practices. If you want to have more information about us, please visit our website at sssihi.uci.edu. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Dr. Karen Lindsay. She is a licensed registered dietitian with the Samueli Institute's Integrative Health Institute, and she specializes in holistic approaches to nutrition and health, especially for women before, during, and after pregnancy. A little bit about her. Dr. Lindsay has clinical interests, including gastrointestinal disorders, autoimmune diseases, nutrition for mental health, as well as weight management. She earned her Doctor of Philosophy degree in maternal nutrition in pregnancy at the University College of Dublin in Ireland, where she also completed a postdoctoral research on healthy diet, lifestyle interventions, and support for overweight and obese pregnant women using a smartphone application. She also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at UCI's School of Medicine's Department of Pediatrics, where she was studying nutrition and metabolic stress and interactions with pregnancy and associated with pregnancy outcomes, infant weight, as well as risk of future obesity. Her research includes human nutrition, nutritional biochemistry, and public health nutrition in pregnancy, as well as behavioral psychology, developmental programming, and childhood obesity. She's got a lot of interesting things to talk about us today. And in addition, she also has clinical activity and sees patients in Irvine as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Lindsay, and her talk today is entitled Interplay of Nutrition and Stress, Potential Role of Mindfulness in the Treatment of Diet-Related Chronic Diseases. Take it away, Dr. Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for the introduction. So I'm really happy to be here and speak on this topic that I'm really passionate about, on the interplay of nutrition and stress, and also how mindfulness might have a role. So the overview of this talk, I'll be looking at the role of nutrition and stress in health and disease, different mechanisms by which nutrition can impact stress and mood state, and then on the reverse, how stress can influence nutrition. So I'll be talking about this bi-directional relationship between the two factors. I'll give an introduction to mindfulness practices and their role in managing stress and eating behavior, and some evidence for mindfulness practices to support healthy eating behaviors and reduce the risk of chronic disease, and then wrap up with some conclusions and implications for clinical practice. So from the whole person health perspective that we talk about in integrative healthcare, there are these 6 facets of overall well-being, and food and nutrition and mind and soul, which incorporate psychological well-being, are 2 really important facets of overall wellness. So in allopathic medicine, we do recognize these factors of nutrition and mental well-being as being really important, but they tend to be looked at more separately rather than the interconnection between them. So mostly today, I'll be showing you a lot of evidence of why there is this interplay between nutrition and I'm using stress kind of broadly. It could be different aspects of mental health or distress in the body. But these are all going to be broken down and the different directions between the two. So first of all, for the effect of poor diet on chronic disease, if you weren't already aware, there is very strong evidence, mostly from epidemiological and observational studies, because it is hard to do long-term randomized controlled trials where we put patients on like a healthy or an unhealthy diet and follow them up long enough to know what their outcome of disease risk is. So a lot of the evidence does come more from epidemiological studies. So that's why we do have mostly moderate grade evidence at best. But there is pretty good evidence for type 2 diabetes, certain types of cancers, fracture risk, and then, other evidence for things like heart disease and all-cause mortality. So we can conclude that diet is important for contributing to the risk of many of these common chronic diseases. Also, mortality is important in relation to diet. So this study on the global burden of disease looked across countries across the world from low to high income countries and looked at how diet is related to mortality risk and concluded that there is suboptimal diet is responsible for more deaths than any other risks globally, including tobacco smoking. So that's pretty stark. And in particular, they found that a non-optimal intake of 3 dietary components were most important for mortality risk. And those components were a low intake of whole grains, a low intake of fruit, and too much sodium or salt in the diet were particularly associated with mortality. And then when we look at stress, so this infographic just shows the different organ systems and ailments that we usually associate with chronic stress. So here we're talking about more of this persistent chronic stress rather than in a very acute stressful situation. The mechanisms involved in how stress impacts disease it's multifaceted. Some of them are listed here. But I want to draw your attention to 2 of these mechanisms probably involve nutrition. So depletion of nutrient stores, because the stress pathways in the body do require nutrients to operate and promoting the stress hormone response. And we also experience changes in appetite and food cravings, which I'll get into a little bit later as well. So to emphasize that these food pathways, nutrition and mood or stress are very much interconnected. And this diagram is busy. There's a lot going on, but it's really showing how the central nervous system and the brain are connected to the function of the gut and then also through the gut microbiome. So the balance of all the microbes in our gut influences both the function of the gut and also influences how the central nervous system operates, the different signals going to the brain, which then influences our sense of emotional, mental well-being or distress in the body. And food is central to all of these pathways because food influences the gut through the digestive system and all the molecules passing through the gut. It influences the gut microbiome. And there are also some direct mechanisms by which food can impact the brain, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. So to really emphasize that there is this bi-directional relationship between food, nutrition, and how our mood state is or mental health. And then on the reverse side, mood or stress levels affect both our food intake on a behavioral level, but also nutrient metabolism, so more on physiological level as well, and I'll be getting into that. So first of all, to look at the direction from how nutrition influences stress or mood state. So this is an area of ongoing research. The field of nutritional psychiatry is really quite new and growing. So I think we're going to see more and more studies in coming years about this. These are 4 proposed pathways that I'll just briefly walk through of evidence that we have today to show potential. There's probably all of these pathways are somewhat involved in how nutrition affects mood state. So first of all, blood sugar regulation. This is probably the most crude of the pathways, probably the earliest one proposed. It probably doesn't explain everything by any means, but it might hint at some mechanisms by which the effect of diet on our blood sugars influences our mood state. So we do see that diets with high glycemic load, in other words, a high amount of sugar or refined carbohydrate, just in observational studies, those types of dietary patterns tend to be associated more with depressive symptoms. But obviously that does not mean that it's causal. But there is some reason to believe that these rapid spikes in blood sugar levels and then the drops in them from eating diets with high glycemic load, that does release counter-regulatory hormones such as cortisol, stress hormone, and adrenaline and glucagon. And these hormones and these drops and spikes in blood sugars are associated with anxiety, irritability, and hunger. But those tend to be quite short-term actions, and then usually eating food sort of corrects those symptoms. But perhaps for people who experience recurrent hypoglycemia, so recurrent drops in blood sugar levels, that seems to be potentially associated with mood disorders. Another pathway is diet-induced inflammation. So we do know that diets rich in sugars, refined carbohydrates, and trans fatty acids, for example, that stimulates immune activation in the body and inflammatory signaling. Also, we do see that certain types of mood disorders can be characterized in some, not all, but in some instances with heightened inflammation. And we also see from observational studies where people with depression, their diet is assessed, and we see that they have higher levels, they score higher in the dietary inflammatory index. In other words, they have more components in the diet that are associated with inflammation rather than anti-inflammatory components. And then also from a treatment perspective, omega-3 fatty acids, which we know have quite potent anti-inflammatory effects in the body, if they're supplemented in people with depressive symptoms, they have a reduced risk of depression via reducing inflammation. So that's some evidence for inflammation being a pathway that links diet and mood state. The gut microbiome is also definitely a pathway of interest, with a lot more research happening in this area with nutrition psychiatry in recent years. And it probably also interplays with inflammation. So we do see that depressive disorder in humans is associated with altered gut microbiota. And very interesting studies several years ago showed that transfer of the fecal microbiome, so an actual fecal transfer from humans with depression into mice, stimulated animal behavior that resembled depressive symptoms. So it really showed a very direct pathway of the gut microbiome in being involved with depression. We know that Western diets, or the standard American diet, where it's high in processed food, sugar, fat, maybe artificial sweeteners, all these components of the diet are associated with an altered gut microbiome and this leaky gut, which is, maybe more scientifically called intestinal permeability. And when we have this leaky gut and the altered gut microbiome, the less healthy microbes in place, they secrete metabolites that get into our blood system, such as lipopolysaccharide being a very common one. And that higher levels of these metabolites in circulation are associated with depression and suicidal behavior in some patients. And then again, from a treatment perspective, when probiotics are administered to people with at risk of depression, there seems to be better emotion regulation and reduced risk of depressive symptoms. So the fourth pathway that probably links nutrition with mood state and stress levels involves neurotransmitters, both their production and their action, and neuronal growth and differentiation. So this is because we know certain nutrients, for example, amino acids like tryptophan, they are the direct precursors to neurotransmitters. So they're literally the building blocks of neurotransmitters. So if we don't have them in the diet, then we're just lacking in those neurotransmitters. So tryptophan is used to build serotonin, which is responsible for feelings of emotional calm and relaxation. So it's an amino acid, we get it from protein-rich foods. It also requires carbohydrate for conversion. So there's another nutrient that's involved. Tyrosine is another amino acid that gets converted to dopamine, also adrenaline and noradrenaline, so involved in the stress response and the acute stress situations, but also, that sort of energy and alertness. So that's why when we have adequate protein in our diet, it contributes to better health. And then choline is a B vitamin that is converted to acetylcholine, a very important neurotransmitter associated with reduced anxiety, improved memory. And we do get choline mostly from animal source foods. It's particularly rich in egg yolk, liver, and other animal products. So there's not as many plant-based sources of it. So it is important to have some of these foods in the diet for adequate choline levels and healthy brain function. And then polyphenols are primarily found in plant-based foods, so they tend to be the chemicals responsible for all the different colors, fruits, vegetables, herbs, and spices. And these polyphenols promote the action of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is critical for neuronal survival, growth, and differentiation. And higher levels of BDNF are associated with reduced depression. So hopefully this is some evidence to show that nutrition is important in both the action of brain and neurotransmitters and influencing mood state. These are some key nutrients that are probably involved in supporting emotional well-being. So omega-3 fatty acids, I mentioned earlier, they have anti-inflammatory properties. They also reduce the surges in stress hormones, so that can promote a sense of well-being. Vitamin C moderates cortisol levels, so it might have a role in the stress response, preventing excess cortisol secretion. Magnesium, we do know that magnesium levels in the blood get really depleted under people with chronic stress. So if anything, the stress pathway is using up magnesium and then can promote deficiency. And when we get low magnesium levels, it interferes with neurotransmitter action, and that creates common symptoms associated with heightened stress, such as fatigue, headaches, and irritability. B vitamins, I mentioned choline, but other B vitamins are also important for regulating neurotransmitters. Vitamin D, we know now that it seems to be really important for reducing risk of depression. So when we have patients with vitamin D deficiency, there's definitely a high risk of depression occurring in those individuals. And then protein, like I mentioned, is necessary to supply the amino acids that support neurotransmitter production and function. But what is the evidence from human studies to show that diet might influence mental health? So it is still emerging. There was this meta-analysis from 2019 that studied 16 randomized controlled trials where they prescribed some degree of a dietary intervention, usually like a healthy diet. There was variability across the studies, but in general, we're thinking of diets that might be like the Mediterranean diet or diet patterns that reflect the dietary guidelines. And we saw that in this study, overall, there was a positive influence. If the healthy diet was being prescribed and adhered to, there was reduced risk of depression. This study also looked at anxiety symptoms, and it found that the effects were most potent among females for both reducing depression and anxiety risk with healthy diet adherence. And then another study where they very specifically prescribed a high polyphenol intake. So I think in this study in particular, they prescribed portion of blueberries daily and dark chocolate, which are two foods really rich in polyphenols that I mentioned earlier, are responsible for brain-derived neurotrophic factor, neurotransmitter action, and neuronal growth. And they found that in this study, those people following the high polyphenol diet versus the people prescribed to actually avoid some polyphenol-rich foods in their diet, those in the high polyphenol diet had reduced depressive symptoms and improvement in mental well-being, although they did not find any specific effects on stress, anxiety, or self-esteem. So in summary, for this component, mechanisms by which diet or nutrition influence mood state, they seem to be multifaceted. It is still under continuous study, and I think we'll be learning more in years to come. But there are many vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and essential fatty acids that seem to be really important in neurotransmitter production and function. So if we don't have a healthy, balanced diet, if we're eating a poor quality diet that is deficient in some of these key nutrients, that'll promote nutrient deficiencies in the body, which may increase vulnerability to stress as well as depression and anxiety. So now to look at this in the other direction. So how stress or mood state influences nutrition. So this really acts on three levels. There is the level of the impact of stress on eating behavior, and then nutrient metabolism, and then ultimately energy storage and expenditure in the body. So I'll be touching on each of these levels. And first of all, to look at eating behavior. So this is a pathway that probably most people attending this webinar can relate to. When we feel stress, heightened psychological stress, we get a release of different stress hormones, ultimately cortisol and adrenaline, especially if it's acute stress situation. That might put us into a fight or flight response. Usually we don't feel like eating in that moment, but after the acute stress has sort of subsided, and this is sort of a letdown period where we're still processing the stress, or in cases of chronic stress, we get decreased serotonin levels. So that's the neurotransmitter that promotes feelings of relaxation and, calmness and happiness. Ultimately, we will get a craving. Usually, most people will experience a craving for sugar and hyperpalatable foods. So that might be that combination of sugar and fat and foods. When we eat those foods, it will cause a spike in insulin levels because consuming sugar or refined carbohydrates will promote some insulin release. And that is actually has a feedback mechanism because the insulin is a hormone that helps us process blood glucose, but it also assists with the tryptophan conversion to serotonin. So if we're low in serotonin levels due to the stress, eating the food high in sugar, high in refined carbohydrate promotes insulin release, which then converts tryptophan back to serotonin. So we get that bump in serotonin again, which brings a sense of emotional calm and comfort. And that is where the phrase comfort eating really comes from, because it physiologically does have this comforting mechanism. So that's why many people will crave these foods in times of chronic stress. But obviously, this is a short-term fix because, relying on hyperpalatable, high sugar, refined carbohydrate foods to help us feel well is not going to be healthy for our physical health in the long term. And it will result in reduced neurotransmitter production over the long term because sort of this blunted effect where we're relying on the food to stimulate it and it stops working as efficiently in that pathway over time. So we'll get chronic low serotonin, low mood and depression, and it is a poor stress coping mechanism just to rely on food as the only mechanism to handle that stress. And then in terms of appetite and actual eating behavior, we see that under times of acute and severe stress, we get a decrease in appetite because we're in that fight or flight response in the immediate term. It's not helpful for the body to look for food and digest in that moment. So in general, animals in general do not seek food in those moments. But under chronic or low stress conditions, there is sort of a divide among humans in how we experience appetite. So 40% of people on average will report increased appetite overall, regardless of what the food is for, or what type of food. 40% of people will experience a decrease in appetite, and then 20% will report no change in their appetite levels. Females and people that score high on emotional eating surveys, so they're more like, they self-report that they have this tendency to emotionally eat. Females and those people tend to be more susceptible to increased food consumption, so just higher appetite and higher food intake under times of chronic stress. But interestingly, across the board, no matter where people fall in terms of their reported appetite levels under stress, people do seem to crave and to consume more of the hyperpalatable foods. So high sugar and maybe that combination of sugar and fat when they are under stress, even if their total caloric intake is not necessarily greater than their everyday intake. So this is a lot of self-reported data and mechanisms, but what is the actual objective evidence for stress impact on food intake? So there are multiple studies that have had similar kind of study designs where they're crossover study designs where participants are brought into a research lab setting. On one day, they're exposed to a controlled stress task. On another day, a non-stress comparison task. So the same people undergoing both conditions on different days. And then they might be presented with a buffet of snacks of different types, depends on how the researchers structure the study. But the participants don't know that the food that they choose to eat after the stress or the non-stress exposure is being monitored. So the researchers just allow them to choose whatever food that they want. So this first study took that model of a stress exposure on one day and then a control exposure in the gray bars. And then they looked at the food intake, total calories over here, and then specifically sweet snack foods or salty snack foods. And what they found was these asterisks represent a statistically significant difference. So on the stress day, more sweet foods were consumed, and that contributed overall to greater total caloric intake on the stress condition versus the non-stress condition. In this next study, they took a similar study design, stress exposure and non-stress exposure, but they just looked at their intake of sweet fatty foods. So they would be an example of like chocolate or donuts and cakes and pastries, a combination of high sugar and fat. And this time, though, this study broke down the cohort by low emotional eaters or high emotional eaters based on a standardized survey. And they found that under the stress condition, it was only those characterized as high emotional eaters in this bar here that consumed significantly more calories from their sweet and fatty foods, whereas those who classified as low emotional eaters actually did not increase their caloric intake. So that shows that there is some individual variability in how people respond in terms of food intake to stress. And then this last study, kind of similar study design again, except this time instead of a survey to characterize their emotional eating response, they looked at their cortisol, so their stress hormone response from saliva samples, and they characterized people as either being high stress responders or low stress responders. And they found that under the stress condition, these bars, they're all black, so it's not as easy to interpret, but the high reactors, so the high cortisol reactors to the stress test, consumed greater calories compared to the low cortisol reactors, who actually potentially even dropped in calories from their control condition. So these studies are just really unique lab-based studies in a controlled environment to show that humans do eat differently under stressful exposures, but there is, like I mentioned, individual variation. I've also conducted a study specifically in pregnancy, as you heard, that my main research focus is in maternal health and across the reproductive life cycle. So this study was looking at pregnant women in a controlled time in gestation. So they were all in that 28 to 32 weeks in their pregnancy. And they came in to the lab on 2 separate days. One day was a stress exposure and the other day was a non-stress exposure. This study, though, didn't look at their food intake in response to stress. We actually gave them a standardized breakfast, this milkshake drink, before they underwent either the stress or the non-stress condition. And then we collected blood and saliva samples over 2 hours after their fasting blood draw. And this was 33 pregnant women. And in this analysis here, I'm interested in looking at the hunger hormone ghrelin to kind of get at how does our appetite signaling change under stress. So actually, interestingly, I found no difference at all. These bars look pretty identical. So there was no difference in the total ghrelin output over 2 hours when those same women were exposed to stress versus non-stress. But I did also collect their perceived stress levels by a standardized survey. So before they even did either of these protocols in the lab, they completed a survey that reported their average stress levels over the past month. And those who scored higher in perceived stress scores had a trend for significantly higher ghrelin levels, that hunger hormone, both in the fasting state, so before they consumed breakfast, and in general over the 2-hour period that we were monitoring them. So a higher hunger signaling in people who day-to-day lives report greater stress levels, even though their acute stress exposure did not seem to influence their ghrelin levels. So now to move on to the effect of stress or mood on nutrient metabolism. So moving away from the actual food intake, the behavioral aspect, and looking at the physiology of nutrient metabolism. So we know from these pathways that glucocorticoids, cortisol being the one that we're most familiar with in terms of the stress response, it has many actions in the body that influence how glucose and fatty acids are handled in the body. So overall, we get increased glucose output into the bloodstream, we get decreased insulin sensitivity, more insulin resistance, we have more circulating glucose. We also get more lipolysis, which is breakdown in fat stores. So we get more fatty acids in secretion and fatty acids being deposited in muscle cells, which promotes more insulin resistance. So overall, we're seeing this picture of higher glucose levels and fat redistribution associated with the higher levels of glucocorticoids like cortisol in circulation. But what does that look like when we actually test it again in these lab-based studies? So similar study design to what I showed in my pregnancy cohort, except this was in a very unique sample of war refugees who had PTSD. And it was a crossover study design where they had a stress test on one day and non-stress control test on another day. But instead of consuming food, they actually were given this 75-gram oral glucose tolerance test, which is the glucose drink we give people to test for diabetes. And they took that drink before undergoing the stress or the non-stress test. And then they were looking at their glucose and insulin levels over time up to 2.5 hours. So what they found was that at 60 minutes, so the gray bar here represents the time the stress test was administered. On the stress day, which is the black line, we see significantly higher glucose levels. We see this spike in glucose. So they all get an increase in glucose because they consumed a glucose beverage. But on the stress day, we get a higher spike in glucose levels compared to the non-stress day. And then also with insulin, we see a greater insulin response, probably reacting to that higher spike in glucose over the 2.5 hour period compared to the non-stress day. So that is, again, like I said, in a very specific cohort and in a small population, but it is quite a unique study that shows how in this vulnerable population, stress impacts glucose and insulin metabolism. Then moving back to that pregnancy study that I spoke about a couple of moments ago, that same study design in the same cohort of 33 pregnant women, I also measured their glucose and insulin levels. As a reminder, I gave them a breakfast drink. I wasn't looking at their food intake. And although I didn't see any difference in their glucose, their absolute glucose or insulin levels in the blood in response to the stress test or the non-stress test, there was no difference. But I did see a difference in two markers of their insulin action. So one was this index of insulin sensitivity. On the stress day, they had lower levels of insulin sensitivity, which is an index computed from the glucose and insulin values. And then also the oral disposition index, which is a measure of how well the body secretes insulin in response to the amount of glucose in circulation. So this index dropped on their stress condition. So in other words, their pancreas wasn't secreting insulin to the same degree under the stress condition versus the non-stress condition. And again, this is different results than we saw in the study I showed you on the last slide, but they're very different populations, right? This is all female population, they're pregnant. The other population was all male and they were war refugees. So there seems to be an impact on glucose insulin metabolism, but it might be very different depending on the population under study. Then looking at triglyceride metabolism in another study of healthy middle-aged adults. This was again a crossover study exposed to a stress challenge task on one visit and a non-stress task on another visit. And this time, instead of consuming food or any type of a beverage, these participants were infused by IV with a triglyceride solution on both visits. And then the researchers monitored how well their bodies cleared triglycerides from the bloodstream over the next 40 minutes after the stress or non-stress exposure. And in this graph here, it's showing that, as the lines go down, it shows that they're being more efficient in clearing triglycerides from their bloodstream. But on the stress day, which is the upper line, we see that there's this reduced triglyceride clearance. So the triglyceride levels remained elevated in their blood over the 40-minute period. And we don't actually know, because they didn't follow them up for longer, to know when the triglycerides even came down to normal levels on the stress day. Compared to the non-stress day, they decreased pretty substantially in a shorter time period. And the men seemed to be more affected by this, in that they had a reduced triglyceride clearance compared to the women. Last in this series of studies to show the effect on nutrient metabolism, this study looked at an inflammatory response to two different meal types. So this study design was a little different. Instead of exposing participants to a stressor in the lab and then a non-stress test, they actually took people, they were all women with a history of major depressive disorders. So they were more emotionally vulnerable individuals. And they actually gave them on 2 different days, 2 different meal types. So one meal type was high saturated fat, which we would hypothesize promotes more inflammation after consuming it. And the other meal was unsaturated fat, high in oleic acid, which is the fatty acid predominant in olive oil. So we usually associate that with anti-inflammatory and a healthy metabolic response. There was equal amount of calories in both of these meals. And instead of exposing these individuals to a stress test, they actually asked them on their previous day before coming into the research lab, how many stressful situations did they encounter? And then this graph here just plots, they measured inflammatory markers. This graph is just for C-reactive protein, but they did measure others as well and saw a similar response. So the high saturated fat meal on the top bar shows that whether or not they experienced 0 stressors the day before or at least 1 stressor, their levels of the C-reactive protein inflammatory marker were similar on both groups of people. Whereas those people who consumed the healthier meal, rich in oleic acid, if they had no stress the previous day, their inflammatory markers were lower after the meal. But if they did have prior day stressors, their inflammatory marker was actually more similar to consuming the saturated fat meal, which I think was mostly butter in this case. So that shows that the quality of the food intake may not be enough to improve metabolic response, that the psychological state of an individual probably plays a role and interferes with nutrient metabolism and might interfere with inflammation after a meal. So last, to look at the effect of stress or mood state on nutrition, specifically energy storage and expenditure. So most studies in this area are preclinical studies. They're looking at animal models because it is difficult to see how stress response influences things like adipose tissue, fat storage and metabolism, because really we need to do biopsies to get that. So it's challenging to do in humans. But the pathways that we know, we understand how they operate with the stress response. This diagram shows here, if stress is induced, we get this pathway from corticotrophin releasing hormone. It stimulates glucocorticoids like cortisol, epinephrine, or epinephrine might be stimulated, especially in acute stress, and neuropeptide Y. All of these different hormones have different types of actions on adipose tissue, as well as the eating behavior and how the brain, I've talked about that already, stimulates appetite and motivation to eat certain types of foods. But overall, we see elevated glucocorticoids seem to impair brown adipose tissue. So that's the healthy adipose tissue, which burns calories at rest. We get less of that brown adipose tissue thermogenesis with elevated glucocorticoid levels. And neuropeptide Y seems to also inhibit lipolysis, so inhibits the breakdown of fat in our adipose tissue and promotes more fat storage. So collectively, these different mechanisms seem to promote more increased fat storage, and particularly we see it in that abdominal adiposity. So that's why quite often we'll see that people undergoing chronic stress, experiencing chronic stress in their lives, have more propensity to store fat around their abdomen, which is also the type of fat storage that we know is associated with more chronic disease risk. So in summary, for the effects of stress or mood on nutrition, we see that psychological stress may induce alterations in both appetite, food cravings, and food intake, but there is individual variation in the susceptibility for the effects of stress on these mechanisms. We also see alterations in postprandial metabolism of glucose and lipids, change in inflammatory signaling, depending on the food intake under cases of stress or low stress, and changes in the distribution and storage of adipose tissue. So collectively, these effects of stress on nutrition, metabolism, can directly and indirectly contribute to obesity and associated chronic diseases such as diabetes and heart disease. So addressing nutrition alone, or even nutrition and exercise with patients at risk of chronic disease may be insufficient to promote good health, especially from this cardiometabolic disease perspective. We also need to consider, I would argue, the role of stress and mental well-being, because we really can't isolate them. They're very much interconnected, as I've shown in numerous studies. So this kind of whole person approach to health may be more effective. So now I'm going to move into talking about how such an approach might work using mindfulness. So how can mindfulness support both healthy nutrition and metabolism via improvements in mental well-being? So mindfulness is, a definition is the awareness that emerges through paying attention on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally to the unfolding of experience moment by moment. So mindfulness is a tool for mind-body health. It's basically a collection of simple techniques that help bring awareness to our current emotions, our circumstances, and behaviors. It's very accessible to all individuals, regardless of age and ability. And there's really good evidence at this stage that mindfulness practices can help mitigate stress and anxiety and improve mental and emotional well-being. So we already know that it supports mental health. But what I'm interested in looking at is a step further. Through improvements in mental health, can we see improvements in physiological health, like these cardiometabolic markers, like glucose metabolism and weight changes and inflammation in the body? This may be through the action of reducing stress. It could also be through changing the way we approach food intake and our cravings for food. So this brings me to mindful eating, which is a component of mindfulness. So it's one aspect we can apply mindfulness to our eating behavior. This has many benefits, including awareness of our true appetite, better portion size regulation, better digestion, because maybe we're eating more slowly, chewing food better. It helps interrupt the stress eating cycle, because if we're experiencing stress and we have a craving for, high sugar foods, for example, using mindfulness, if we can pause, acknowledge the emotions we're experiencing, acknowledge the cravings that might be arising, but maybe not act on them because maybe we've got other tools to help handle that stressful situation, that we don't have to rely on the food intake to bring that emotional comfort. So that is a really powerful technique that mindfulness can help us with. And also promotes us to enjoy food without guilt. So too often we see patients where they try and go on diets and they fall off the bandwagon and then feel guilty and shame. And that just puts them in a downward spiral of then eating more of the unhealthy foods that they were trying to avoid in the first place. So what is the evidence for the impact of mindfulness on these different aspects of health when we're thinking of metabolic health? So this first meta-analysis was looking at the impact on weight in people that were looking to lose weight, and also their eating behavior. So eating behavior, obesity-related eating behavior, such as emotional eating behavior, restrained eating, or disinhibited eating. There are different things that we can measure by validated surveys. So on average, the studies included here, they had various different types of mindfulness-based interventions. So there is heterogeneity in study design. Some of them might have focused on mindful eating. Some of them might not have focused on mindful eating, but just general mindfulness-based stress reduction or other aspects of mindfulness. But on average, the weight loss seen from pre to post treatment in those undergoing the mindfulness-based interventions was 6.8 pounds immediately post-intervention, and then at a follow-up time point, and there was variation in follow-up, it could have been 7.5 pounds. So that's not insignificant weight loss. And these are people who are not being prescribed a diet or exercise plan, right? They're just being coached on mindfulness behaviors. There was moderate effects on weight loss pre-post analysis, but there was moderate level of heterogeneity across the study, so it decreases our reliability on the data. For controlled studies where they had a mindfulness-based intervention compared to a control group, which is obviously going to be a more rigorous study design, there was moderate effect of the mindfulness interventions when they were compared to specifically an active control. So when the control group was told to do something else that wasn't mindfulness. So it could have been an exercise program, for example. And then there was also moderate effect of the mindfulness interventions on improved eating behaviors, so less emotional eating behavior overall in those controlled studies. And that was pretty rigorous, great evidence, low, moderate heterogeneity. And these studies did show that there was larger effects on weight loss for the mindfulness interventions that used a mix of formal and informal mindfulness techniques. So a formal mindfulness technique might be going through an established standardized program like mindfulness-based stress reduction. It's a very standardized 8-week course that is a very standardized curriculum. Whereas informal mindfulness practice might be just encouraging people to slow down their eating, chew food more mindfully, could be just pay attention when you're feeling stressed. So that combination of integrating mindfulness into people's everyday lives and a formal mindfulness program seem to be most effective for weight loss. And to look at studies where they evaluated the impact of mindfulness on glucose control or glycemia. This systematic review and meta-analysis was done specifically in patients with diabetes. So it was both type 1 and type 2 diabetes patients. There was only 8 randomized controlled trials included, but there was less heterogeneity in these study designs because they were a very specific population group. And they were all looking at A1C levels as a primary outcome. So lower A1C levels, better glucose control over the previous 3 months. And they found that the mindfulness-based interventions were associated with a significant but small improvement of a reduction of 0.25% in their A1C levels. So that's shown down here in the forest plot where it favors the mindfulness intervention. And subgroup analysis showed that there was greater reduction in A1C levels in those who already started with slightly better glycemic control. So their A1C value at baseline was less than 8%. And also if they had a longer follow-up duration, there was better improvement seen over time. But there aren't really many studies or any that I've come across yet looking at this in non-diabetic populations. So that's an evidence gap. And then in this study, they were looking at blood pressure effects from a mindfulness intervention. So again, this study was quite, this meta-analysis was looking at studies which were more homogeneous in that they were all prescribed the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, which I mentioned a moment ago, very standardized 8-week curriculum of a mindfulness training program, and compared them to control. And all the patients in these studies had hypertension or pre-hypertension, so they were at that at-risk level of high blood pressure. Overall, the mindfulness interventions showed a benefit on both systolic blood pressures, shown up here in the top forest plot, and we can see here it shows an average reduction. I think it was around a 3-unit reduction in blood pressure and systolic blood pressure and in diastolic blood pressure. So the effect was actually more significant for diastolic blood pressure, but the effect on systolic blood pressure increased with a greater proportion of patients on antihypertensive medications. So that tells us that that combination, that this is really integrative healthcare at its best, where we use medications where indicated, but also maybe other more holistic interventions such as mindfulness. That combination of treatments seems to be very effective in improving blood pressure control. So in summary, for the effects of mindfulness interventions on cardiometabolic health, we found moderate evidence for effects on weight loss and improvements in eating behavior compared to more conventional lifestyle approaches. There's also moderate evidence for beneficial effects on glycemic control and hypertension in at-risk patients with those conditions. And the mindfulness-based interventions may offer comparative effectiveness to traditional lifestyle interventions for some metabolic markers, or they may complement existing lifestyle interventions. So we're not saying that we should all just be focusing on mindfulness for our patients and forget about diet and exercise and medications. It's more likely that it's complementary in nature, by the name suggests, that adding on this modality could improve the benefits even more from traditional lifestyle or medication treatments for chronic disease risk. But we do need further research studies with longer follow-up in particular, with a particular focus on disease prevention with mindfulness-based interventions. So to wrap up, the integrative health approach that I would promote for nutrition counseling, that we promote at the Samueli-Institute, is to take more of this whole person perspective, to not only just focus on what somebody's eating and prescribe a diet plan, but to consider the emotional factors that also come into play in influencing eating behavior, that influence their metabolism, educate patients on the role of stress in influencing their weight and their metabolic markers. So for example, somebody suffering with high blood pressure or poor glucose control, identify if nutritional deficiencies are present, which could actually influence their mental and emotional state. So as I showed at the beginning of the presentation, certain nutrients are really important for regulating mood state and promoting lower risk of depression and anxiety. So specific nutrients may need to be brought back into the diet, either through food or supplements or a combination. And then I like to personally provide guidance on mindful eating practice, because I see that it is very impactful to steer people away from traditional weight loss diet programs and actually take this more complementary perspective and introduce mindfulness into their lives if they're not already aware of it, and how that can help support the positive relationship with food. So conclusions and implications for clinical practice. Nutrition and stress each play a crucial role in the development and progression of most chronic diseases, and these factors are often interrelated. So on multiple levels, we can't really look at them separately. The root cause of obesity and related chronic diseases may actually lie in the complex interaction between the brain, the gut, metabolism, rather than only lifestyle habits. So it's not always a case of just eat less, move more. There's a lot more to that. We really need to take this whole person approach, and addressing psychological health may be necessary in conjunction with nutrition. Mindfulness practices probably are a useful tool. At best, they're not going to be harmful to support psychological and behavioral health. And integrative health takes a whole person approach to supporting well-being, preventing disease using these complementary approaches. But we do need more research to demonstrate the efficacy of some integrative health approaches, in particular mindfulness. The studies are still mostly focusing on psychological health benefits, which is great, but I think we really need more evidence to show how they actually might also support physiological and cardiometabolic health benefits and reduce the risk or severity of chronic diseases that our populations are struggling with. So thank you for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay, for that interesting talk. Very, very relevant for today and for all of us at all ages. Diet is very important. I want to just remind everybody that if you've got a question and you would like to ask it, please just go ahead and type it into the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll take your questions. We do have one question currently. We've got two now. So the first question is from an anonymous attendee. they wanted to know how was stress enacted in the prenatal examples. So this was going back to your first study that you talked about, how you had this experimental stress, and I think they're asking like how was that enacted?
Yeah, so great question. And what I used in my protocol is what many protocols use. It's the Trier social stress test, which is a very standardized, well-validated protocol for inducing temporary psychological stress response in individuals. So it involves putting people in an unexpected situation, telling them that they have to prepare a speech. So the traditional one is telling them to prepare a speech for a job interview and their strengths and weaknesses. And then evaluators come in, video camera in front of them, and tell them that they're going to be recorded and evaluated, and they have to keep talking for 5 minutes. And then that's followed with a complex mental arithmetic task. So that's the Trier social stress test. It's a standardized 15-minute protocol. That's what I used in my study with pregnant women. Some of the other studies that I presented also use that protocol or sometimes slight variations of it. And some studies do use other types of stress tasks, but they're usually sort of putting people under a cognitive challenge in an unexpected situation where they're not anticipating it. So hopefully that helps explain it.
Great, great. There's another question related to the pregnant sample. So the question was, in the study with the pregnant people, was it controlled for age, and what were the ages of those in that study, if you happen to recall?
So the effects were not controlled for age. Age didn't seem to have an impact on I know there was two outcomes that I was looking at. There was ghrelin and there was the glucose and insulin response. Age was, they were all adult women to start with. There was actually a limitation I did in that study. I don't think we recruited anybody over age 40. So we do know that gestational diabetes risk increases with older age in pregnancy. So we had everybody between the ages of 18 and 40. So there was some variation. From my memory, they were all mostly in and around, like there was an average age of 30.
Excellent. We have a couple questions about mindfulness. One is coming from Virginia Kimonis. Do individuals need to be of normal intelligence, and have studies been done with cognitively challenged individuals? So thinking about the mind and what it might play a role.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually am not aware of studies that have specifically prescribed mindfulness interventions in cognitively impaired individuals. That's not to say they haven't been done. I don't believe they've been done looking at these cardiometabolic outcomes that I've been looking at specifically. They may have been done looking at other psychological well-being outcomes, and maybe I'm just not aware of them. But it is a really good question, and I think that is an important population to consider with mindfulness interventions because, from my knowledge and practice of mindfulness, perhaps such individuals may not be best suited to a standardized course like the mindfulness-based stress reduction, but that doesn't mean that there's very simple tools and practices that we could still promote in everyday life. Just being very aware of, for example, if we take mindful eating, for example, encouraging somebody to slow down and chew their food and, maybe count the chew, look at their food, smell their food. They're very simple techniques that many people could engage with. So there's a whole variety of mindfulness types of techniques and tools that we can teach people. And some would probably be better suited to people with cognitive impairment than others.
Yeah, so yeah, that's interesting. Another question about that. Can you talk a little bit more about the mindfulness techniques that have been used? Is one technique better than another now that you're talking about the different kind of techniques that mindfulness entails?
So a lot of the studies that have been done have looked at these standardized courses like mindfulness-based stress reduction because it's just the most validated and widely administered mindfulness way of teaching across the globe. So that's kind of the founder of mindfulness, that he founded that course, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So just because it's most prominent, it tends to be used the most in studies because they can say, well, it's a validated, rigorous course. But that study the meta-analysis of studies looking at weight loss as an outcome and eating behaviors, the studies that are included in that meta-analysis, I mentioned they had both formal and informal mindfulness techniques in some of the studies. So I need to go back to the individual studies and see what the informal mindfulness techniques were that they prescribed. I'm guessing it was probably around mindful eating, which wouldn't be a huge focus in the standardized mindfulness-based stress reduction course, if that makes sense. So to sum up, most of the studies are using the MBSR course because it's validated and standardized, but they might also tweak it, change the protocol slightly, maybe not do it over 8 weeks, maybe shorten it and condense the curriculum. And they might have other homework to tell people to do that might be some variation from the course.
Great. There's an anonymous question. Are there any specific labs that should be requested and tracked in addition to adding mindfulness? Like what type of labs would you want to track in a patient that's, coming to you?
So, I mean, I'm very interested in these cardiometabolic labs that I was talking about in the presentation. So that would be glucose and insulin metabolism, their inflammatory markers, and blood pressure is something that's really easy to measure without requiring a blood draw, and triglycerides, fatty acids. They're all metabolically, knowing the physiological pathways, they all have the potential to change via mindfulness and stress reduction modalities. I don't think that, this really needs to be done still in a research setting rather than a clinical setting, I would say at this point, because we don't have enough evidence to show that we should be tracking it in clinical patients yet. But from a research perspective, they are all the ones that I think should be looked at. Inflammation is something that has really been understudied in relation to mindfulness, which I think is such a shame because there's so much potential through regulating the nervous system to change inflammatory markers and have such a systemic effect on the body. So there's a big research gap in looking at changes in inflammatory markers in response to mindfulness.
And then in relationship to mindfulness, are there any helpful suggestions about things that you can eat that might increase serotonin? You did mention egg yolks, but not many others.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for that question. So like practical examples of foods, we're thinking of foods that are rich in B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids, protein-rich foods. So a whole foods diet, really, if we think of like the dietary guidelines or the Mediterranean type of diet, is rich in all the foods that would hit on those key nutrients that we know are supportive of neurotransmitter production and function. So fatty fish, oily fish like salmon, for example, tuna, sardines, contains the omega-3 fatty acids. And nuts and seeds are great sources of both protein and minerals and B vitamins. Whole grains like brown rice and quinoa will contain the B vitamins as well. Leafy greens, rich sources of B vitamins and polyphenols, herbs and spices. So it's really a variety of these whole foods. I don't think there's, oily fish and egg yolks are particularly concentrated in things like omega-3 fats and choline and also some vitamin D in egg yolks. So I think those are really key ones. But if we just think of a whole foods diet, fruits, vegetables, oily fish, eggs, maybe some dairy and leafy green vegetables, nuts and seeds, if you have a diet rich in those foods, it's going to be supportive of mental health as well as all the physical health benefits.
Great. We also have one of our last questions, it seems like, is from Tanya Zabalagui, about your slide on neurotransmitter production, neural growth, and differentiation. Where do you suggest that we can find some more resources about that, about the neurotransmitter production and growth and differentiation of nerves? And also, they want to know what's your daily nutrition look like? Do you practice mindfulness? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. The additional resources, off the top of my head, I'd probably have to, find some resources, and maybe if I find something, I can have Camber circulated to our audience afterwards. I think that might be a helpful post-webinar resource. There is one author that I'm familiar with that publishes a lot in this area of nutritional psychiatry. Her name is Felice Jacka, so Jacka is her last name. And she publishes a lot on this area of nutrition and related to mental health. So that would be, if you're looking in PubMed, an author to look up. In terms of my diet, I do practice what I preach. I like to say that I do all the foods that I just mentioned, that the healthy whole foods diet is really what I like to emphasize. A lot of vegetables. I do eat meat and fish. I love my fish, in particular oily fish. So a huge range, nuts and seeds. That kind of classic, virtually no processed foods, and very little of foods that come out of packets where you can't really understand the ingredients on them. That's what I try to avoid and tell my patients to avoid. And I do practice mindfulness. I try to be mindful while I'm eating, not always successful, but I do have a mindfulness practice. So thank you for that question.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay, for your excellent presentation and very exciting questions that were asked by the audience. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today as well. Our team will email all registrants the link to this recorded session, so you will get an email with that. We hope you can join us at our next research webinar, which will be on Wednesday, May 29th at noon with Dr. Robert McCarran, who will be presenting on translational clinical education to help build integrative psychiatric workforce in the US. And also, please just be on the lookout for any announcements via email and also on our webpage, uci.ssihi.edu for the future. And thank you very much. And that concludes our talk today. So thank you for attending, everybody.
Thank you.